So I didn't have a scholarship,
Yeah.
so I had to actually pay my own way, and this was for various sort of administrative reasons. So I ended up taking a lot of jobs during my student days. So I worked as a cray fisherman for three months. I worked as a weighbridge officer. I worked as an assistant electrician. I worked as a person in an auction room. I worked as a quantity surveyor. I got a whole, had a whole string of experiences to do with different types of jobs, and that's how I, not entirely, but I paid most of my way through university. Now that brings me to the end of my first degree, and of course the relationship with my wife went from strength to strength. Right, we're still here and enjoying each other's company and so on. So, so yeah, that wraps up. So there was a bit after that. Right?
Oh yes, we'll go on. How is it that you got from Western Australia to Cambridge? That's the next adventure.
That's the point we've reached. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I and Juliet decided that after graduating, we wanted to leave Western Australia and go back to, as I would put it, back to Europe. Of course, we ended up in England. But anyway, the intention was to go back to Europe. So before doing that, I thought, well, I've got a degree in mathematics, and I better make sure I have some sort of meal ticket. So I enrolled for 1 year in a diploma of, what was it called? Numerical analysis and automatic computing. Right? And so for a year, I retrained, if you can put it that way, as a computing person. I wouldn't at that stage computer science, that's a modern invention. Surprisingly, I discovered that I liked it. So from being, if you like, a person who really saw himself as a mathematician come physicist come something else, I suddenly became really quite enthusiastic about computing. So anyway, clutching this certificate, and my wife had a diploma of education, so she also kind of retrained because she also did a degree in mathematics, right? And we discussed it, and you know, we agreed that we'd rather be somewhere else for a while, and somewhere else was here. So we had these certificates. We got on a boat, and with a number of other graduates, as it turned out, we came to England. And before setting off, I wrote to a large number of places. In fact, I wrote a slight misrepresentation. I wrote the original letter, and my wife dutifully copied it out onto longhand, onto air letters, right? And these letters were sent to places in England mostly, which did computing, like computing centres, if you like, saying basically, here I am, you know, I've got this qualification in computing, have you got a job? And surprisingly, so this is the interesting thing, I didn't come here to do a PhD, I came here to do a job. Cambridge, through, probably mostly actually, through Nick Jardine, and I'll explain it a bit more, because the letter went to the computing service in Cambridge, and there was a guy there called Eric Much, who was the head of the computing service, and he obviously had an interest, and but he couldn't create or didn't have a job, a full-time job, so he must have contacted Nick, or Nick must have contacted him. Anyhow, between the two of them, they said, well, we think we may be able to give you a job as a programmer. So I said, great. So I waltzed up here now it must be about 69, I think. I waltzed up and had an interview with Nick Jardine in college, and he said, well,
in King's,
yeah, in King's, and he said, well, you know, I can give you part-time employment, but you know, the computer lab wants you to do some work for them. So I said, fine. And so gradually I started doing work. Now, Nick's had a project. Nick had I think it was an EPSRC project, which he shared with Robin Simpson, also at that time in King's, and they had just finished their PhDs on automatic classification, right? But this was automatic classification in the biological sciences. And Eric Much didn't last very long. He died almost immediately I arrived. But then somebody else took over, looking after me, if you like, on that side. And they asked me to implement a subroutine library for numerical analysis, which I did, and it ran for many years on Titan, actually. Anyway, so I worked for them for about 6-9 months, and then I said to Nick, I think it was, Nick Jardine, I said, look, I'm getting very bored. I mean, the work they gave me, I knocked off very quickly. I said, I don't know, what am I going to do? I mean, there just doesn't seem to be enough work. And so Nick said to me, well, had you thought of doing a PhD? And I sort of said, not quite, but I sort of said, well, what is a PhD? And of course then there was a discussion about that. And so then I enrolled for a PhD, and the idea that I had for the PhD actually grew out of the work I was doing for Nick and Robin in the research centre, the King's College Research Centre, is to try and use automatic classification techniques in information retrieval. So I already had an interest, funnily enough, I don't know how this came about, but I had interest in information retrieval before I left Australia. So when I arrived in Cambridge, I'd already read about information retrieval in the library in Australia. So anyway, I put those two things together. I thought, well, there might be some mileage here. I mean, there's something that can be done with automatic classification techniques and information retrieval. So I then I sort of steered in that direction, and that of course is how I got to know Karen. This is one of the bits.
Karen Spark-Jones.
Karen Spark-Jones. Now this is one of the bits which one may want to keep private, because you see, my memory of it may be imperfect for one thing. But anyway, so the college, King's College, was going to have me as a research student, yeah, and they're actually going to support me because they said I could pay home student fees instead of overseas student fees, and the college arranged that, so they subsidised me. But now this is what one needs to check. But the way it came across to me as a naive student was that I could do a PhD in information retrieval providing I was not supervised by Karen Spark-Jones, right? This was one of the conditions. I mean, maybe it wasn't even put as blatantly as that, but anyway. And Ken Moody, who at that stage had an interest in databases, took me on as a PhD student. So now I think that was a stroke of genius, right? Because, right, I collaborated with Karen all along, right? But it wasn't sort of a student supervisor arrangement. So she was generous in giving me access to the data she had, test data, and so on. And she was actually very helpful. But she was not my supervisor. Everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people think that I was supervised by Karen, but I wasn't. And in fact, I also got quite a lot of help from Roger Needham. I mean, the history of information retrieval in Cambridge is quite interesting.
Tell us it.
Sorry?
Tell us it. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit. I mean, I can't tell. But anyway, the Roger Needham, famous computer scientist in a totally different area, he did his PhD in information retrieval. In fact, I suspect it's the first PhD ever done on information retrieval. So that makes it fair. And he was supervised in that work by David Wheeler, who's one of the pioneers of computer, and worked with Maurice Wilkes. So there is this sort of progression of things. So there was David who supervised Roger, and then Roger, to a certain extent, helped me, and certainly Nick and Robin, especially Nick, had conversations and serious discussions with Roger about their work in automatic classification, because he and Karen worked together in the Cambridge Language Research Unit, as it was then, on a
theory of clumps. Yes.
right. So that's Karen and Roger, and I think probably Roger was the person who made the original invention of clumps. They worked on this theory of clumps in the Cambridge Language Research Unit, and in fact, I think Karen got her initial ideas about information retrieval probably from Roger. Roger was there first, if you like, and Karen came in as a linguist. She did her early work, her PhD work on linguistics, which apparently even now is still read and considered to be very good. So
it was on stemming and stripping. And
no, it was on. I think it might be some sort of morphological stuff. Synonyms. That's right, synonyms. Yes. So her thesis was republished recently under pressure from a chap called Yorick Wilkes. Right. Yorick Wilkes was also a member of the Cambridge Language Research Unit. I don't know if you knew about the Cambridge Language Research Unit, but it had a chap in it called Fred Parker Rhodes, who may also have done some work on information retrieval, and of course Margaret Masterman, who she was the wife of Richard Braithwaite. Right.
Yes.
I think she might have been the boss of the Language Research Unit. Anyway, that was a group of people who worked, well, the group that I knew about anyway, worked on language, linguistics and so on, and then shaded into stuff on information retrieval. So I made contact with that side of it. Now, what's interesting is that there was when I arrived and I was starting to work for Nick and Robin, there was this huge disagreement, intellectual disagreement between them and the Needhams, as they were then called, because the clumping process was considered to be very unprincipled, right? Whereas the approach adopted by Jardine and Simpson, which became a book, Jardine and Simpson Mathematical Taxonomy, was considered, and correctly so, very principled and mathematically well defined. And as it turned out, the algorithms or the methods of automatic classification that came out of the Jardine and Simpson stuff was relatively efficient, whereas clumping was a process of automatic which was horribly inefficient. Right? So there was always this argument going on, and I suppose what happened in the end was that this Jardine and Simpson stuff, right, which turned into my stuff too, survived, whereas the clumping stuff just didn't go anywhere. So I sort of was caught between these two groups, but I had my office in the research centre, where at the same time Dennis Mollison, who's a probabilist, was also working, and then there was Nick and Robin and Nate.
You say probabilist. What is a probabilist?
Oh, he's a man who studies and develops things in probability theory.
Right.
So his application was, funnily enough, pandemics. So, like, he would have had mathematical models for the current flu pandemic. He became a professor of statistics at Heriot-Watt, and he was on the fringes of our project. Actually, he wasn't mainstream. Now, the other person who was quite involved with the project was Ken Moody. Now, he was more, I don't know whether he was officially written into the project proposal, but he was certainly acting as a bit of a consultant. So he designed the original algorithm, I suspect, for a sequence of cluster methods called BK, and it was based on the core of that was based on some of Ken's work, right? And of course he was my supervisor, and again it worked out extremely well because how do you put this? He took an interest in what I was doing when it really mattered. So he would, he would leave me alone because I had this context in the computer laboratory anyway, which I shared with a lot of PhD students. sent up a distress signal, he was usually there, and he read, because I was an appalling writer to begin with. I just, it was so condensed, right, so that every paragraph, if I were to write the same stuff now, would probably take several pages. Anyway, so Ken actually, took me in hand and got me to think about how to write things. And again, I needed that very much. So anyway, so this information retrieval work sort of progressed. I went on to do my PhD thesis on automatic classification techniques in IR. I used them, I tested them, and showed that if you used automatic classification techniques in the way that I did, at least on the data that I had, it showed that you could get major performance increase. But on the way, I also invented a evaluation measure, a measure for evaluating information retrieval systems, which is to this day is still used, and in fact is used very widely in speech recognition. So it was adopted by another field as a measure of retrieval performance, and I defined that. And it's theoretical work that I really enjoyed doing. It was I went back to some theory called the theory of measurement, which sort of talks about, if you want to measure something, where the objects you compare are in a qualitative relationship, then what you have to do if you're going to actually use that quantitatively, you have to define a mapping from these qualitative arrangements to a numerical representation where the properties of the qualitative structure are preserved as much as possible, and so you turn it into something in terms of numbers. I took that approach to measuring performance in information retrieval. In other words, I wrote down the sort of intuitive conditions of relationships that were important in IR and the ones that you wanted to measure, and then defined this mapping. And I came up with this new way of measuring things, and it has persisted. It's still used in information retrieval, and as I said, it's still used in speech processing. So so automatic classification, the methods and the algorithms for IR, and this sort of evaluation technique were really the guts of my thesis. As I said, Karen, who really was not mathematical, right, on the whole, helped me with the sort of linguistic stuff. So she was the one that explained to me, about stemming and stop words and things like that, and the way it was driven by some background in linguistics. And also she had access, she had built up some test collections, as we call them, and she allowed me to use them. So our interactions were mostly around the experimental side of information retrieval. So that takes me to, there are lots of things that happened in Cambridge while I was doing my PhD. My wife, for example, taught at a number of schools, especially at Islington Village College, and after the first 6 months or so in Cambridge, which was very difficult, we really ended up being quite happy being here. So Maurice Wilkes, well, you see, he only entered into my life towards the end of my PhD. He really didn't see the point very much of information retrieval. So the chronology of this is a bit confused because I've never really bothered to tie it down. But I thought that information retrieval should be subject in university in the computer science curriculum, and he never really allowed that. And Karen, I think, sort of half agreed, but I think she was quite ambiguous about whether she wanted information retrieval as part of You see, she had quite an interesting attitude to IR. She saw it very much as a postgraduate activity, but then she took very few PhD students. So she had one, a chap called David Jackson, who preceded me, and after that there was a huge gap. I mean, I can't even think of the one that she did supervise, but she on the whole did not want to supervise PhD students in IR. What she did do is she did supervise PhD students in natural language processing. So this is her background in linguistics that made her do that. So
didn't she supervise Martin Porter, or were you?
Yeah, but that was not in information retrieval.
That was in natural language, I think.
Yes, well, no, it was actually in something quite different again. It was in macro processors. You know, there was a language called Snowball.
Yes.
Right. Well, he designed and invented a comparable language. Right? He was, as you know, he was a superb software engineer. Right?
Yes. Tell me something about Martin, because I've worked with him for many years.
I know. I will tell you something about Martin, but you have to just
Wait.
allow a little bit further, because Martin came into our lives when I came back from Australia. So when I took my PhD, I was headhunted by the professor of computer science at Monash University in Melbourne, and he worked on automatic classification. His name was Chris Wallace. He was a very, very, very able and very good academic. He did a lot of good work on classification, but again, it was different from the automatic classification work that people did here. Sufficiently different for it, you know, if you like, not to have much contact with it. So I went out to Monash, Australia, and because we went, and one of the nice things that happened was that my daughter, our daughter, was born. Nicola. She was born in Melbourne, Australia. So soon after we got there, I don't know, in months, probably 5 months or something like that, she came into being. And I was a lecturer there in computer science, and got very bored. Just, I don't know, the change of environment, I'm not sure what, but I mean, it didn't work. Boredom is probably the best way of describing it. I had nobody to talk to really about information retrieval. So I had this idea that since I had nobody to talk to about information retrieval, I would talk to myself. So I wrote a book about information retrieval, which was effectively talking to myself about IR. And it did well, actually. I mean, surprisingly, I didn't think it was going to do well at all. I thought it would just disappear like many books do. But in actual fact, it's still used to this day, which is a bit embarrassing. So anyway, so I did this thing, and then halfway through my contractual period at Monash as lecturer, I returned to England, to Cambridge, to try and figure out if there was a way I could come back. And so Karen, I think, said to me, well, why don't you apply for one of these Royal Society research fellowships? I mean, she'd had one, and so it was labelled in some way. And I said, okay, I'll apply. And that would enable me to come back to Cambridge, right, and to both the King's and to the Computer Laboratory. And I did just that. I applied, and surprisingly, I got it. And so, after having spent 2.5 years in Monash, I came back to Cambridge as a Royal Society research fellow, and you know, made my home here. I bought a house. We bought a house, and now, what did you ask me about? Martin, yes. So, right. So this is an interesting story. So academically, there was a development going on in information retrieval, which turned out to be extremely significant. And in fact, it's probably theoretically one of the most important developments in the subject. There are various models for information retrieval, and we now call them models, and there's the standard one, the oldest probably, which was what we call a vector space model. I won't explain what it is, but associated with a man called Gerard Salton at Cornell. But the sense was that there was enough uncertainty in information retrieval processes that you had to use probabilistic approaches. So the first development in that area was actually a thesis, well, not the first, but the first major development, written by an academic at Newcastle University. He invented a new model on probabilistic retrieval, as it's now called. Anyway, but the trouble was that the model was only a half a model. So Karen, working with Stephen
what was his
Robertson.
name? What was his name?
Yeah, I know. I knew you were going to ask me that. And
Doesn't matter.
I've
You can
lost
put it in.
Yeah, I've lost it. You can put it in.
Yeah.
So Stephen was working with Karen at that time about this. But what had happened was that Stephen was also in danger of not having a job. So we actually created a project, right, to employ Stephen Robertson as an RA, right, and on that project, we employed Martin Porter. So he was actually an RA on the
research assistant.
Yeah, research assistant.
Yeah.
So that's how it came about, and he was working on probabilistic models for IR project, and he was so the suffix stripping algorithm, which is called the Porter algorithm, right, was invented on the project. In fact, I gave him the task of building one, and he did a fantastic job. He went and read in sort of all the literature on suffix stripping algorithms, conflation algorithms, and from a linguistic side, from the computing side, and so on. And then he put it all together, and he produced this algorithm and this program, right, which did the job. And it was just, it's still used. It's still, any information retrieval experiment that's done, or even commercial systems, they tend to use the Porter algorithm. And so that's how Martin came on the scene. But he was not really a researcher. He was more of a developer, right? He liked to have to work out some idea, right? Maybe change it a bit, but then he'd want to have the job of writing the software and building it and so on and so on. And that's how he came around. He and Karen, right, and this is now I can say this probably, but he and Karen did not get on. So one of the problems we had on the project was that every so often we would need something from Karen, and then Karen would have would give Martin or Fred, as we used to know him, give him a hard time. And he was not good at coping with that. I think you probably remember what Karen was like. She was very forthright and would tell a spade a spade. And Martin was not like that really. He didn't want to be hassled. So he used to get very upset. And this could. Now Stephen actually, as it turned out, although he was going to be on the project, he then at the last minute got a job, and so he was became a co-investigator with me. So we had this joint project, and we employed Martin as the.
So you'd rate him as a very, very brilliant computer, whatever you call them, scientist or
Who?
Martin Porter.
No.
What would you say? How would you?
I think he's a brilliant software engineer.
Software.
No, if software engineers fit into computer science, then he's a brilliant computer scientist too. But I'd be much more specific.
Yeah.
I would say that he's a brilliant he's one of the best software engineers I know, actually.
Is it?
Yeah, no, really, in terms of getting things done and building the software and so on. I mean,
Were you involved with the Muscat
he
system or Sedge?
Muscat, I was on the fringes of that. He took an earlier system that he had written for the museum documentation people, and then extended it, as I saw it, with some information retrieval functionality, right? Which he probably, some of that he probably got from working with myself earlier on. He sort of internalized that, and then used those ideas to build Muscat. He did well with it. I think he didn't. I mean, it was a sort of a product for a company.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And he went on from there. But we only he's rather withdrawn now. He doesn't make contact much.
Yeah.
I don't see him.
He has a firm called Grape Shot with John Snyder,
Right.
which I can tell you about afterwards.
Yeah.
We started this conversation actually with Maurice Wilkes. You were going to tell me something
Yes.
about Maurice.
Yes. Yes. Well, you see, okay. So what happened is that my relationship with Morris became more, I wouldn't say intimate, but firmed up when I became interested in Alan Turing. Right? Now, I think Morris is very aware of his position in the history of computer science, and rightly so, because he's one of the founders, if you like, or the pioneers, and certainly you could make the argument that he built with David Wheeler and Stanley Gill and so on, he built the first real computer. So there's an argument between Manchester and Cambridge who takes precedence, and I don't really want to buy into that, but Morris would claim that the first real computer was built in Cambridge. So this is the ADZAC. Now, Alan Turing, especially at the moment, but certainly towards the beginning of the 80s, the end of the 70s, became more well known for his work. Now, you've got to understand, I'll give you context to make that understand. So, in about 1978 or 79 or thereabouts, the Scientific Archives in Oxford rang up the college, King's College, and said, we have all these papers by a man called Turing, and he seems to be originally from King's. I mean, would you like to look at them, or send somebody to look at them, and tell us whether they're worth preserving? All right? So, the librarian here at the time, I think was called Peter Crofts.
Yes,
Croft?
that's right.
Yeah. He got in touch with me, probably on the advice of somebody else, and said, you're a computer scientist, would you like to go to Oxford and have a look at these papers? So I went across to Oxford. And
Had you heard of Turing by then?
I was just, like everybody else, I had heard of a Turing machine, right? And I knew what a Turing machine was, and I think I may even have had an inkling on the decision problem that Turing wrote about in his famous paper and so on and so on. But honestly, I don't think I knew very much about him. However, so I said, yes, papers are good, bring them to King's, right? And then, of course, progressively King's got more and more serious about them, and I helped them actually. I got some money at various stages to help. But at the time, right, I wasn't the only one. Most people had not heard of Turing. If I said Turing, most people would say, who is Turing, right? All right, so, but what happened was that I actually talked to Wilkes at some point, to Morris, and he clearly felt that Turing was being given too much prominence in the history of things. Yeah? And you can see it from his point of view, because Alan Turing was a theoretician, and he wrote this incredibly smart paper in the 30s on the Schrodinger's problem, and then after the war he spent his time in Bletchley Park and so on, and involved in the design of computers not the Colossus. That was nothing to do with him. It was the bomb, right? And he became knowledgeable, if you like, about the design of a potential modern computer. And after the war, he wrote a well-known report. I think it was called something like ACE, the ACE report, when he was working at the NPL, which was a blueprint for designing a computer, which was in contrast to a similar report that was written by John von Neumann, which was the ADVAC report. So the ADVAC report has priority. It was the first complete design for a modern computer. Turing's came a little bit later. In fact, I think Turing actually cites it. Wilkes, on the other hand, I think he started to think about building a modern computer, and we're talking about building ADZAC, and he got his information from the same sort of sources that von Neumann and Turing got it from. So there were these people, Eckert and Mauchly, who gave courses in the what's it called, the Moore School of Electronics in some university in the States. I can't remember the name of the university, and some of them attended it, and that was the source of these new ideas about a modern computer. I think Wilkes' attitude to it was, I'm just going to build it, right? He was an engineer, and that's exactly what he did. He started putting things together. Now, he tried to collaborate with Alan Turing, and they did not hit it off, right? Turing did not like Wilkes, and Wilkes did not like Turing. So this went absolutely nowhere. But then, to continue on, the ADZAC was built and was a success in a sense. The ACE machine that Turing designed, which is different from the pilot ACE, that's just a side issue, was only built very much later in the 50s, and so its impact on the design of the next generation of machines was actually not very significant. However, I think, and this is just guessing, but I think that Morris sees Turing, in a sense, as maybe unjustifiably getting, support more than he ought to, because he was, his claim to fame is really on the theoretical work, and as far as building the first computer, right? I mean, his engineering skills weren't all that great, and it just didn't make it at the same time. So there is a kind of a contention between those two, you see. But as you know, I mean, nowadays everybody's heard of Turing because of the book by Andrew Hodges, and then there's the film. And if you go to a bookshop, you find any number of books now, sort of vaguely talking about Alan Turing. So he gets quite a lot of, given quite a lot of prominence actually, and maybe Morris feels that this is nice, but in actual fact, it's possibly giving a bit too much visibility to Turing, given what he's actually what he's actually accomplished. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Turing, but it's more so because of his theoretical work, right? I mean, I think that his thinking about, where he eventually came up with his computational model, the Turing machine, I think was fantastic and an incredible breakthrough. But his contribution to the actual building of computers, I think, is nowhere near as significant as Morris's.
I mean, the popular mythology is that he saved us from being conquered by the Germans.
That's what Winston Churchill says, but I think the accurate description of that is that I think that Winston Churchill wrote to him, and I think he might have said, I'm not sure, there will be some sort of records on that, it shortened the war by something like a year, right? So that's the effect of Turing. Because Turing, so there's an interesting story there actually. I mean, it's all much too complicated, but he started work on the decoding, decrypting, and he used his theoretical knowledge to do that, and bomb, right, was the first sort of mechanical device to do this decoding, was based on the sort of theoretical ideas that Turing had while he was at Bletchley Park. But you see, after that very early period, he was not actually working on that anymore. He got moved on to, I think it was on speech encryption and decryption. Actually, the work that led to the Colossus was an independent development, and Turing was only on the edge of that. Yeah. So, but the early work, which is what he initiated with, what his brains initiated with, right, was clearly a significant part of decoding the Enigma traffic. Yeah. So yes, he deserves the credit.
Someone who shortens the Second World War by a year is perhaps worth some
absolutely
remembering.
Absolutely. No. I mean, the story of Turing is very sad actually, because I mean, he as you know, he was subjected to horrible pressure in Manchester. He moved to Manchester, as you know, towards the end of his life, and worked in the computer laboratory there. And he was a homosexual, and I don't know. At some point, it came out that he was, and you know, he was forced to take drug treatment or something.
Yes.
Yeah. It was all very unpleasant. I mean, I tell you what though, the little book that his mother wrote about him is extremely good. I mean, everybody sort of poo-poos it. I think it's a delight to read actually. Sarah Turing, she wrote a little book about Alan Turing. It's very nice. Yeah. So anyway, I have actually interviewed Morris about Turing, and somewhere I kept some notes because I wanted to know whether he had read the ACE report, the report that Alan wrote about the design for a modern computer, and Morris claims he did not read it. He was not aware of it, I think. He claims that he worked independently of what Turing was doing. So, who knows?
I'll just come back very briefly to probability theory again. Again, kind of the popular vision, in my mind anyway, is that before there was a paradigm in information retrieval was hierarchical databases, Boolean searching,
Boolean searching, yes.
and or not searching, and that dominated the field. And then there was this paradigm shift to what some people vaguely think is similar to fuzzy logic. In other words, you don't have to exactly know what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's
you
right.
can put in a string of search words, and that this was really a terribly important shift in information retrieval.
It was.
And I tell people, you were right in the middle of this. I've never been able to quite say what it was that...
Well, you see, the thing is that it's one of these awkward situations. I was at Monash at the time that Stephen and Karen were working on this, and I also had made the shift in my mind. And I had a student actually build a probabilistic search engine for a sort of student project at the same time. And my approach to it was slightly different. I took a decision theoretic approach. So I developed some sort of decision theory, and in fact, so when Karen and Stephen produced their model, their paper, if you like, a draft, they sent it to me, and I reworked it in decision theoretic terms, which I still think is a good way to do it, because of the certain applications actually, and so there was this kind of debate going on between the three of us about how to formulate this and so on. And so yes, I mean some people would say that the probabilistic model, because I wrote about it in the second edition of my book and gave a very, very extensive account of it, would say that it was actually developed by the three of us. However, if I'm brutally honest, I certainly think that I probably had the same ideas to the same extent. The paper that was published by Karen and Stephen, basically is the first sort of publication of that work, although it has a subset in it, right, which they credit on the decision theoretic approach. Yeah. But it is I mean, in the other way I was in the thick of it is that I started building, together with Martin actually, started building implementations of it, right? So, for example, the relevance feedback that comes out of that model, right? I still have some notebooks somewhere that says, the first ever implementation of the relevance feedback. So I was much more interested to get it working, right, than to at that stage than to refine the theory. But it's very I mean, like a lot of these things, it's very difficult to pinpoint where the breakthroughs were made, because as I say, there was this earlier thesis by this chap from Newcastle, who actually ended up in Glasgow University, who had quite a who had a pretty good formal development of it, but there was something he didn't do. He didn't actually seriously take into account the non-occurrence of things. Right? It was just the occurrence, right? And so if you like, it was a sort of a half a model, and then it was completed, and the first presentation of the complete model was in the paper by Karen and Stephen, I should have had my name on that, but I didn't. So some you win, some you lose. Yeah.
Which actually leads to a question I always like to ask, which is how do you work? I mean, particularly when you think you're having really creative or interesting thoughts. Do you have these when you're going for a walk, when you're having a bath, when you're cooking, or when you're sitting at a computer terminal?
No, I don't get them at a computer terminal. Absolutely not. The other thing is I still to this day I still handwrite all important stuff first.
Yeah.
And I don't handwrite them on the whole time. I don't handwrite. I'm one of these people who actually works in cafes. Right. So most of my papers were drafted by hand in a notebook in the cafe somewhere. So I worked for a long time in the copper kettle, the old copper kettle.
Did you?
Yeah, and I wasn't the only one actually. There were a couple of other people there.
You ought to have a plaque for all the people.
Yeah, well, the person who really was interesting actually, which I didn't realise about, is the chap who obviously contributed significantly to string theory. I think his name is Green.
Yes, Green.
Well,
Green.
I only realised who he was because we never used to speak to each other, right? We would be working. That he was sitting in another corner, right, doing his mathematical equations, right, and he was working on string theory. So, no, I get them. I used to get them. I don't take baths so much anymore. I used to get them in the bathtub. That's quite true. I used to take long baths, and weirdly, I used to get them when I would be cycling. So my wife would comment on this. When I suddenly perk up and say, I've sorted something out at last, and sitting in coffee shop drinking endless cups of coffee on my own, right? I would say that it would be unusual for me to get an idea or to sort something out, as I would put it, sitting at my desk, staring at a blank piece of paper or staring at a computer screen. I can't sit still for very long either. I have to go. I mean, if I work for about an hour and a half, I then have to go for a walk anyway, right? So I'm a restless researcher. I just now there are people who can go to their room, spend all the day sitting in their room. I don't know what they do in their room, but they're certainly in their room all the time. Well, I'm not like that at all. I have to move locations. I have to. Physical activity in between seems to matter to me. I just. So,
the legs are the wheels of invention is another of Einstein's
is it?
saying. Yes.
So it's coffee.
So, well, as you know, the famous joke, scientists are machines for turning coffee into theorems.
Mathematicians.
Yes, mathematicians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Let's move on now to well, there are two other questions I'd like to ask. One is music. Some people think music and mathematics have some affinity, or some people find music helps them in their creativity and so on. Do you enjoy music?
Very much, but it's very much oriented to the voice and jazz. So my background is that we did not have any. Well, first of all of my family, my brother, my sister, my mother, my father, they did not play any instruments. Secondly, until the age of about 16, there wasn't a record player in the house, so if you like, I would say that certainly my mother and father were pretty much what you might call amusical. Right? My brother, on the other hand, I think was fairly musical. He liked to play the mouth organ, but even he was exposed in the same way to not being any music in the house. So I only discovered music gradually, but I absolutely adore opera, and I adore all sorts of singing type of music, and I am a great fan of jazz, especially blues type jazz. I listen to Coltrane, for example. Doesn't necessarily blues. So there is a whole genre of jazz music that I listen to, but the mostly I listen to opera, and I use music as a kind of a way of relaxing. So that if I used to take a bath to do that. Now, if I come home and I'm absolutely shattered, so if I put on a piece of music, for example, recently I'm listening to Handel's Julius Caesar. I'll put that on and I'll listen to the whole opera. It's like having a nap. I just completely regenerate. So I don't create music, but I do.
So Handel is one of your loves?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah,
and mine too.
Oh, is he? Yeah.
He's about the only person. I mean, I listen to endless Handel, and
Yeah,
particularly the operas.
Yeah, that's what
You know they're doing 5 of them here in the autumn.
No.
I'll tell you about it.
Yeah, I'm going to one in the Edinburgh Festival. I think it's called the Metro. I've never heard of it.
They're doing 5 day after day here, English National Opera. I'll tell you about it after the interview.
Yes. Well, I'd love to know about that. So I'm, and so is my wife actually. We both enjoy. We tend to share taste in music. So we go to opera. So when we travel, we go to cities on the continent, like Vienna or Milan or any of these places. We almost always try and get a ticket for the local opera and go to it. Sometimes these operas houses are very weird. I mean, we've even been to the Wexford one, the tiny opera house. So it's not just the music actually. I like the performance. I like the actual. I like to see the thing staged. So music is quite significant. I suppose you could say that it's a regret that I never became competent at generating them, but I don't miss that actually. I'm quite happy to just I mean, the thing that I do a lot, of course, is I read a huge amount of fiction, and both in English and in Dutch. I mean, I've kept my Dutch going, so I'm still fluent in Dutch, and I read every time I go to Holland, and that's sort of once every 3 or 4 months. I buy some Dutch fiction, usually classics, that I never read, and I proceed to read them. So I'm an avid reader of literature. So again, it's a way of escaping from the technical stuff that I do. I need a change of context. So if I get fed up with what I'm doing, then I'll read a book, some bit of fiction, and it helps. It just sort of a change of mind. So yeah.
Well, just one last question, unless I've missed out. I mean, I've missed out the whole last 20 years of your life, but
That's right. What did I do in Dublin and what did I do in Glasgow?
there's always that feeling. But I often ask scientists and others if they had advice to a young person coming out, starting up, say, on their PhD level, about how to have an interesting theoretical and intellectual career in the sciences or arts.
Yes.
What advice would they give them?
Right. Well, I mean, I've supervised successfully, I would say, about 30 PhD students, and about 60% of them are full professor around the world. So the supervision that I do obviously kind of works. And I've thought about that a lot. So in my supervision of PhD students, what I try to do is to engineer one thing. This is the central thing, is that I want them to have the central idea themselves. They should come up with it, if they possibly can. I mean, I might stimulate it, and then I want them to end up owning it, so that when I start to argue with them, right, they show clear signs of ownership, that it's their idea, not somebody else's idea that they're arguing about. And then I feel that once they reach that point, they've created an idea, and they own it, then they're well on the way. Now, how do you do that? So what I say to students, you should follow, to a large extent, your nose. You should choose something. You should do something you're interested in, that you want to do, and not something that you're just told to do. It's all the business of making them take possession of what it is, and those are the terms that I usually try and discuss these things with them. It seems to, well, it seems to work. That's all I can say. I mean, I've had students where it hasn't worked, obviously, and that's been extremely difficult, and generally they don't do so well in terms of a career afterwards. But the ones who latched onto something and then developed it, and then they recognise that it's theirs, right? It's not their supervisor's idea. It's their own idea. Yeah.
We've got 3 or 4 minutes. So is there anything, I mean, apart from the last 20 years of your career, that you would really like me to have asked you about or spoken about?
No, I don't think so. I think what I believe and have believed very strongly in the sort of academic way of life. The thing that, and I've enjoyed it immensely, right, all along, but the thing that I resented in the last 10, 15 years is the extent to which the bureaucracy in the universities have started to drive things. In other words, they create circumstances and they create things, right, which academics have to respond to, right, which are basically just stopping you from doing the intellectual work. In other words, it's not as I feel that academics should just do intellectual work, but the burden of doing the non-intellectual stuff, right, and dealing with either the national bureaucracy or the local university bureaucracy, that burden has become rather excessive. And that's one of the things I think is very sad, actually. So my daughter is an academic. She's a postdoc in neuroscience, and I can see that the pressure is there already for her to cope with certain bureaucratic excesses, as I would call them. So that's
that's a sad thought to end on, but a lovely interview. Thank you very much indeed, Keith.